Why did Korea insist Moon Lovers was a failure? Y'all, why were you so mean? That's what this video ended up turning into. I just really wanted to get to the bottom of why. Initially, this video was going to be a look back at Moon Lovers and what made it so popular and addicting and such a fan favorite, despite some maybe clear and substantial flaws. But then, as I was doing the research and diving into the archives of the Korean press coverage and media criticism of the day back in 2016 when this first aired, I was kind of struck with something, and a question kept running through my head, which was, why did Korea insist Moon Lovers was a failure? Why is that not the way I remember it? And I guess, who even gets to decide what a failure or a success is anyway? I guess that's 3 questions, but let's get into it. Cutting in here to give a brief description of the show, because apparently in my original recording, brief ended up being 10 minutes long. Moon Lovers, Scarlet Heart Ryeo is an adaptation of a 2011 Chinese drama called Scarlet Heart. IU plays the main character, who is a modern woman who somehow time slips back into Goryeo times 1,000 years ago. And this is the time of Koryo's founding emperor, who had a number of sons. And IU comes to befriend all of the various princes in different ways and develops meaningful bonds with all of them, whether as love interest, friend, or advisor, servant in some cases, or even sister figure. And in the course of living in these times, she ends up getting caught up in a lot of these interpersonal dynamics, relationship conflicts, power struggles, political strife, and all sorts of other dramatic events. Our main character, Jun-gi, plays the 4th prince, the black sheep of his family, the outcast. He is in turn disdained and also feared by his family, and as a result he's both isolated and love-starved and just craves any sort of connection, whether it's familial or friendship or romantic love. And IU, coming from the future, sees him just as another person. So she sees him for what he is, doesn't treat him like he's a monster or frightening or repellent, and he just finds that so novel and becomes fiercely attached to her. And of course, then becomes obsessed with her. And that intense relationship that develops between them, it provides like the push and pull that drives a lot of the emotion and intensity of the drama. And even though there were ups and downs in terms of like the execution of the show, that was enough to carry me through. It was the lovers that could not be, or lovers that transcend time and space, and ultimately the culmination of that romance, but then that tragic twist at the end. And I think that's maybe the feeling that gets a lot of us fans unable to let go. There were definitely things that you rolled your eyes a little bit at, or you kind of let slide if the main storyline was enough to carry you through, because it was so immersive, at least for the people who were into it, and there were a lot of people into it. And I actually rewatched the whole thing in preparation for this. I didn't mean to. I was just kind of like looking at the past episodes to refresh my memory, and then I just got sucked in again, which can kind of proves my point. And I think this time around, even knowing where the pitfalls are, I think I liked it even more. Or maybe it's because I knew where the pitfalls are and I was prepared for them. They didn't matter so much in the context of the larger story, which I think had some really strong qualities going for it. I also remember the show as having a lot of potential, and I think if I was dissatisfied in any way, it was largely because it was so close. You could see what it wanted to be and what it could have been so clearly, and yet it didn't get there. It felt so obviously short that sometimes got me mad. Not at the show, but just what could have been, I wouldn't say Moon Lovers was a hot mess. It was maybe like a warm disarray. I think I mourn the loss of the show that it wasn't. And to be fair, despite my affection for the show, I do remember a lot of the criticism at the time. I didn't disagree with it. I thought there were a lot of fair points made. It didn't necessarily contradict how I felt about it, but I could acknowledge that they were there. Here's the thing that I don't think I remembered accurately, or maybe time shifted my perception of what I thought it was, is that the media criticism and just the overwhelming response at the time, I don't mean fan response, I mean sort of like industry response, Korean media, Korean mainstream public response, was overwhelmingly negative and critical, to the point where reading it now I was like, y'all, why were you so mean? It seems a little over the top. So I think that was the question I really wanted to answer, is the disconnect between what was written on the page, what is perceivable in the archives, and sort of the dissonance between how we remember it now. Just to give you an idea of the negativity that I'm talking about, let me just read off some of these headlines that I found. And I'm not cherry picking, these are most of the headlines. So you have things like, what was the reason for the failure of IU-led Moon Lovers? Or Moon Lovers slump? Was it really simply IU's fault? Cheesy fusion sageuk Moon Lovers. Failure to earn viewer sympathies. The risk of 100% pre-produced dramas. Even Moon Lovers collapses. Will Moon Lovers remain in last place till the end? Why was Moon Lovers crowded out by the competition? It was a little hard pressed to find something. Like, I didn't find articles saying how Moon Lovers, it's really not that bad, you guys. Or Moon Lovers improving episode by episode. You didn't see that. It was kind of like a dog pile. I know that human nature likes to jump on a dog pile, but I don't think that can be the only explanation. It's one of them, but I wanted to dig further. So I think we have to start with expectations, because the single easiest way to set you up to disappoint is to set unrealistic expectations. And maybe they weren't unrealistic, but they were very lofty. And there was a ton of buzz going into the show going in. I think not least because it was based on a Chinese super, super, super hit drama, which was such a phenomenon. So back in 2011 is when the Chinese drama enjoyed its first season's massive run, and then it came back for season 2 a couple of years later. And I heard about this drama in all of my circles, and I even tried to watch it because I'm a little bit of a completist, and I was like, oh, I totally want to watch the source material before this new drama comes on. Side tangent, I'm going to be shallow for a second here because I'm a little embarrassed to admit, but I tried to watch the drama Scarlet Heart because it had such rave reviews, and then I couldn't, you guys. I couldn't get past the hair. I couldn't. I'm sorry. Like it was just so. I wasn't familiar with this part of Chinese history, and also, I mean, kudos, I guess, to historical accuracy. But okay, Scarlet Heart, the 2011 Chinese drama, is the drama that made me realize that maybe I'm okay with dramas not being historically accurate. Because before that, I would have said I was a bit of a historical purist, and I really appreciated when dramas took a lot of effort to honor realistic things from the past. And then I saw the hair, you guys, and then I was like, okay, I wouldn't have been mad if you gave them hair. Anyway, super, super popular source material going in. Also, you know, this was a massive production budget. It was one of the larger production budgets of the day. I think it was something like 150, not million, billion. In any case, it equates to about 13 million US dollars. I remember doing this math recently for the Descendants of the Sun video, and basically it was just a little bit more than Descendants. It was also 100% pre-produced. This was at a time, at the very, very brief sliver of K-drama production history, where people were going really gung-ho on pre-produced dramas. They were really bullish on them, and they were pursuing them with a lot more enthusiasm than they had been previously. And then also the star cast. I mean, you have not just star leads, because, you know, star leads in every K-drama, but I think the stacking of the cast, and a very specific kind of stacking. So you have IU and Jun-gi as the leads, and they're both very famous at the time with massive fandoms. Not as famous or as massive fandoms as they are today, because they have since even grown since then, but still very large. And then because of the story of having all of the young princes, you had to stack your cast with young, hot, up-and-coming actors. And a lot of them were sort of in that early phase of their career where maybe they hadn't yet proven their acting skills, but they had platforms like Baekhyun from EXO in his acting debut, and then Nam Joo-hyuk in one of his earliest roles. Same for Jisoo, Kim Jisoo, and Kang Han-er, of course, playing the main second lead. He had just come off a massive run on Miseng and was making a name for himself as a strong, critically acclaimed kind of actor. You had like one of those trendy OSTs where every track was done by somebody, you know, very popular and trendy. So you were positioning this to be a massive mainstream popular hit, and particularly with the young audiences, because it was going kind of like young fusion trendy. And the director, you know, I will say we'll talk about him in a second. This was also in the period where Chinese interest in K-dramas was at its peak. Like I said in the Descendants video, as was the case for Descendants, the rights for Moon Lovers were sold to air concurrently in China with the Korean broadcast. They had a crazy per episode price, which was $400,000 per episode, which amounts to $8 million. So that is more than half of your production budget right there. I mean, this one was, you can understand, like with the source material and the popularity of the cast in China and abroad, that was a fair bet to take. You had everything going for you, and when you build up expectations to that degree, you have to deliver, because I think even a slight disappointment earns you more. What is it? The higher you go, the harder you fall. And that definitely happened. To be clear, the show was not perfect. A lot of the criticisms were valid. My sort of takeaway is that they were disproportionate to what maybe the show had earned on its own, but taken on their own, agree with pretty much all of them. So one of the major ones was immediately it felt off. And this one I lay at the director's door. At this point in his career, he was a well-known and respected director, PD Kim Kyu-tae. He had done some very well-regarded dramas like action spy thriller Iris and the Song Hye-kyo Cho In-sung melodrama That Winter the Wind Blows. He was somebody you would put in squarely safe territory, and immediately you were like, oh, there's something weird about the execution of the show. By that I mean the craft of it. There was a dissonance between the kind of show that they were going for, slash we were expecting, slash it was positioned to be, which was a young, fusion, trendy, sageuk historical romance. One of the most common complaints about the show is that, oh my god, he was obsessed with extreme close-ups. And this is also something that he had done in That Winter the Wind Blows, but I think maybe got away with it because extreme close-ups in that show, which was one of those like heart-wrenching romantic melodramas, maybe served the intensity of that drama. But he used it in Moon Lovers almost just as like one of his standard shots. And it's when you overuse this, it loses all of its meaning and you're like, why am I staring up someone's nose? It is extremely effective in a highly charged emotional moment, but he was using them willy-nilly left and right in just ordinary circumstances. And I think it has this also side effect of like breaking the fourth wall. When you're not only extreme close up on an actor's face, but they're staring directly at the camera. And he would do these exchanges where like one actor is talking to another actor, but both of them are getting the direct extreme camera shot. And so you're like, are you even talking to each other? I couldn't immerse myself in the scene because I kept thinking, oh, are they just like both talking into the camera instead of to each other? Ostensibly, these two characters are talking to each other, but it just feels like they're both talking to the camera. Like breaking the fourth wall does not work unless you're doing it deliberately for a certain effect, but I think it was unintentional. So I think it was just like a miscalculation. And he also used a lot of like these handheld, shaky camcorder shots in ordinary scenes. Shaky cam footage can be so effective when you're using it for a purpose. Like you're in the middle of an action scene, or you're on the field in Friday Night Lights, or it's a way to feeling like very intimate and in the moment, in the middle of certain kind of conversations. He was just using them everywhere. And I thought, what is the purpose of this? Like, did you just learn how to do this? And then he would do these weird, instead of doing cuts from actor to actor, he overused the trick of the swish pan where you're like, shoo, shoo. And again, when you do that without meaning, you're like, what am I watching? All of these tricks that he was using that stood out to us, it also felt like it didn't fit the genre of the show. So breaking the fourth wall and these like swish pan zooms actually gave a comedic effect, because a lot of times they're used for comedic effect. You know, like think about The Office when somebody says something funny and then you swish on to Jim to get his reaction. That's what we were seeing, except there was these like tense political dramatic moments.
날개를 내놓기 싫으시다면 심장은 어떻습니까?
It made me feel like, one, the director had discovered some toys, and two, that it was like old-fashioned. It made me just think, The thing in his head and the thing on the screen, they're not matching up. And this is not just me being nitpicky. Fans called out the directing immediately. So the drama aired episodes 1 and 2 on a Monday and 3 on a Tuesday. It was Monday, Tuesday drama. And then in a move that is not really precedented, I suppose, on the weekend, I think on Saturday, they hastily put together a director's cut where he re-edited some of the footage to address the viewer complaints and like cut out some of the extreme close-ups and just mitigate some of the things that people were complaining about. So the fact that they had to do that after 2 days, like the first 2 days of air, tells you that not only was it a prevalent complaint, but that it was strong enough that one, the production was willing to act on it, and two, they must have been pretty darn nervous about it, because that's a kind of what's the opposite of a power move, right? Like, it's a very nervous move to do that so early in. And oh my god, that's not even all. So episode 1 to 3 air, then they do the director's cut of the episodes 1 to 3, and the week after episode 7 aired was Chuseok week, which in Korea is like the biggest holiday of the year. It's called Korean Thanksgiving. A lot of people go home and like you sit with your family in front of the TV and you watch a lot of just comfort television. And so it's a very big opportunity. So what they did was they did a recut, like a condensed version of episodes 1 through 7 to be like, hey, everybody, catch up on this show, which to me, again, is kind of a desperate move, but they were like, oh my god, this drama's not working, the ratings are down, like they were in last place from the start, we put too much money into this, we gotta like pour some life into it, give it some CPR. Did it work? Not really, I don't think. The ratings remained depressed for most of its run. It did tick up towards the end as they kind of got more, the story started to ramp up and head toward its conclusion. And at one point, I think it finally did, rise in the ratings. But overall, it was just a disappointment on that front. Honestly, it's really too bad that so much of the missteps were visual, because the drama really is beautiful in many moments. It has some really gorgeous landscapes and scenery and some very epic moments of grandeur. Plus that rain scene, that rain scene when none of the princes can help IU, but Jun-gi steps in to shield her from the rain, despite knowing he'll be punished for defying the emperor. That scene is the crux of the best of Moon Lovers. And I mean that narratively, emotionally, romantically, and visually. Anyway, the pre-produced angle was also, I want to say, a double-edged sword. At the beginning of the year, so in early 2016, you had Descendants of the Sun burst on the scene and shoot into the stratosphere and seemingly overnight prove that pre-produced dramas, they can succeed, they can be the future. I think people wanted to believe that narrative because I think everyone will agree that pre-produced dramas, like actually filming, shooting, and editing your shows before they broadcast on TV, is a much healthier production system than the live shoot where you're like filming as you go. Nobody thinks live shoot is easier. They just do it because there are other benefits that come with being plugged into the system in that reactive mode. So they were all willing to believe that pre-produced dramas were the future. Unfortunately, earlier that summer, Uncontrollably Fond aired, and it was also a big disappointment. I wouldn't say like a huge flop, although now I'm curious to know if the archives will tell us that it was a massive flop. But it was sort of like, maybe we were a little hasty in thinking of pre-production as the future. And then Moon Lovers comes just a little bit afterward and has a similar struggle. Now it's sending these sort of warning signals of like, this isn't working. Maybe we were wrong. Moon Lovers, in that sense, wasn't allowed to make a mistake and be evaluated for it on its own. It was wrapped up in this larger narrative of like a failing system. Aside from the directing and the expectations and the ratings not measuring up to par, acting, that was another big ding against the show. Again, I don't disagree with any of the criticisms that were made about the acting. IU and Baekhyun were singled out as the two worst examples. I mean, they even call it like foot acting, of terrible acting. IU, of course, being the star of the show, was the biggest target. Lee Jung-gi was largely recognized to have done a fantastic job. I think he was amazing. This is probably one of the best fits for his acting range. I think that, he's always searching for something to really like sink his teeth into, and sometimes the material doesn't hold up. But I feel like this was a really good project for him, and he is one of the reasons it did work as well as it did. IU, on the other hand, you have to also remember this is IU before Hotel Del Luna, before When Life Gives You Tangerines, before My Mister. So before she had proven her acting skills were actually there. She had done acting roles before, but they were all in that kind of like middle range where she wasn't terrible. I don't think she was ever roundly criticized for being a poor actor, but I also don't think that they were shining examples of her being stellar either. I mean, that would come later. But here, she was coming off, more modest shows. Like she had done Dream High and You're the Best Isun Shin and The Producers, where I thought she was good, but they were all lighter roles. And this is the first one where she had to be a little bit more weighty and dramatic. And I think the directing really worked against her, but also I don't think she showed her full range or her full potential in this. I think there's like a lot of criticism leveled against her for not really understanding the period nature of the piece. I know she's a time traveler from the future who goes back into Korea times, but in the show she is in that time period for like a decade. There are points where she should be acting a little bit more 사극 like, and she's not. She's acting like she's a modern girl playing dress up, and I don't think that on its own would have been so bad, except that the princes, the actors that she was acting against, were doing the same thing. And so all of a sudden it felt really weird and anachronistic to have them just like acting like modern people in costume. And Baekhyun, in his acting debut, was unfortunately, I think, the worst. And he and IU had a lot of early scenes together, and I think the tenor of the show was a little too lighthearted for the material. They were like jokey and goofy, and there are like some scenes where they're fighting, like physically brawling and going like around in circles, and it feels like something out of a straight up screwball comedy. Like you could play that Benny Hill music over it and it would be like just a comedy bit. Here's the thing, if you're doing like a fusion sageuk and you're going for that playful, upbeat, funny, romantic comedy vibe, that's all good and well. Like if you want to be hwarang, be hwarang. But this drama, I think, still carried the aura of something trying to be dramatic and serious, that when it then went overly childish and comedic, it felt very strange. I do remember being like, can we fast forward and get to the good parts? And the drama was really at its best. I think it takes about like 8 episodes for it to start getting really gripping, and then once it kind of ditches the attempt to be light fusion humorous, I think it really comes into its own, finds its center, and develops from there. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, that's too late. That's like almost halfway through the drama. If you've lost those viewers, you've lost those viewers. I also think that because you got so many young hot things to be your princes, they were hiring for star power and trendy vibes rather than talent. And by that, I don't mean to be that dismissive. I think all of the cast, I get why they were cast. Just to give you an idea of the kind of messaging that we were getting from this casting, we meet all of the princes for the first time shirtless. They engineered this royal bath scene where we get to see them all together, and that just told us exactly what kind of drama we were supposed to expect. Ironically, I really feel like that move undersold its own potential, because the drama was so much more than a parade of hot guys, but that was not the message we were getting. Although, as a side note, I am kind of mollified that at least Joon-gi's introduction was the one prince who came in clothed. But I think they were too green to really work. And so even in my rewatch, I was watching some of those scenes with like princes number 10, 13, 14, and you're like, oh, they're just reciting lines. Nam Ji-hyuk, much better now, but back then he was just saying words. I think because you had them together in a cohort doing this together, you were like, oh, it's so jarring. You don't have somebody good to like uplift them. And when it's them against, like, so when it's Baekhyun against Lee Joon-gi or against Kang Han-er, because you have that veteran actor kind of just like helping you along and drawing you into the scene, they do much better. But when it's the green actors kind of amongst themselves, it does really fall flat. Another factor that cropped up that I don't think anyone really foresaw happening was there was a direct time slot competitor called Love in the Moonlight. And you had Moon Lovers and Love in the Moonlight. They just kind of happened to have very similar names. Love in the Moonlight was also a youthful fusion sageuk. Very different story, total different feel, because that one has much more of like that fizzy romantic comedy vibe to it. But there was enough comparison there, plus the fact that Moon Lovers had been sort of expected to be the massive ratings winner, and Love in the Moonlight was sort of the underdog there. And then Love in the Moonlight comes along with a lot lower expectations, and it was the front runner in the ratings, and people had a lot more favorable opinions about it because it was a fresh story and the acting was very on point with Park Bo-gum and Kim Yoo-jung, and that one was a fusion drama that felt fusion. That one had a stylistic cohesiveness that made you feel like, the stuff that's happening is ridiculous, but it's all of a piece. And so this is all intentional, and it felt like a complete finished product. Whereas I think Moon Lovers felt like it was trying to do too many things at once and couldn't really decide what it wanted to be, and therefore suffered by comparison. It's always easier to reduce something into the most extreme version of itself than to acknowledge the nuances of both, because I love Love in the Moonlight, but that's also not a perfect show. But it made for an easier soundbite to just be like, this is the one that failed and this is the one that came out on top. It just makes for sort of like an easy story of the David and Goliath story. Like, I think once the anointed one falls, it's almost like a sense of schadenfreude when people almost enjoy kicking something while it's down, which contributes to that feeling that I'm sort of grasping at of agreeing with everything that's being said, but not agreeing with like the overall picture that's being painted. Because I was sort of like, no, you guys, it's not bad. And I think that was where the fandom and the mainstream really experienced a big divide. All that said, overwhelmingly, the fan perception of this drama is positive. It was positive at the time, but I think at the time it was a little bit more positive in the face of criticism. But now, with the benefit of 10 years of elapsed time in between, I know it's what happened with me is I forgot. I forgot some of that stuff. I hadn't forgotten that there was criticism, but I think the exact tone of the criticism and the harshness of it had sort of faded in my memory. And so what I had been left with was this feeling of affection for something that hit my emotional buttons in a way that I found really gratifying, also a little painful, but ultimately in a way that I enjoyed. All the other stuff faded away because it doesn't matter at the end of the day. When you're left with the art, when you're left with the work, everything else falls away, like the reactions and the ratings, and it's like so far beyond when all of that is relevant that it's just the interaction between the viewer and the work. We're left with the things that really matter to us, and the other stuff doesn't feel as important anymore. It also makes me think back to that divide that I was describing in the moment, like in real time in 2016, that was happening, where the fandom was finding a lot of joy in the show at the same time that the media, and I will also say like the Korean public, was kind of enjoying dunking on the show. It's so interesting that the fan voice at the time then is like the counter, because the mainstream voice was the prevailing voice. And I have to remember that this is pre-streaming. I mean, there was, some streaming at the time, but this is pre-Netflix's big investment in Korean dramas, which really, I think, ballooned around 2019. So I remember Drama Beans covering this too. And back when we were doing that, the mechanism that we were employing at Drama Beans at the time was to report on what was being said in the originating industry by the people in that industry machine, sharing that with the outside fandom. And that mechanism has changed a lot. Part of that is, I think heavily due to this post-streaming era that we live in that has democratized a lot of this information and review sharing and criticism. But back in the day, it was like either you were part of the originating industry / machine, or you were people like us, fans on the outside, looking in, reporting back what they were saying. And so we were translating, quite literally, the Korean press and their take on it. And even if we didn't agree with it, that was the prevailing sentiment, right? This was the argument that was being put forth, that here are all the reasons why this show is tanking and not doing well and not meeting with a positive reception. And I think we felt, maybe more than we do now, I think we felt like our place as fans outside of the machine meant that our opinions didn't necessarily matter in the same way. But the big irony, the beautiful irony that I love to consider now, is that ultimately the fan opinion is the one we remember. Okay, maybe like I'm conflating all of us by saying we because I forgot, and that's what I'm left with remembering as the good stuff. But I have to believe that I'm not just an outlier here, that this is sort of how a lot of us kind of remember these things happening, where people were telling us that this was a failure and we were like, okay, the prevailing opinion was that it was a failure. We don't accept that now. I think that's like the most interesting thing if you think about it. In Korea, all we have to go on in terms of hard numbers, right? Aside from like people liking a thing and not liking a thing and posting on message boards, in terms of like actual empirical numbers, we have ratings, we have export dollars, we have numbers provided by big industry machines, whether it's like a Yuko streaming number or an iQIYI streaming number. So we have things like, oh, Moon Lovers spent $13 million on this production, and yet it was last in the ratings for most of its run. It had single-digit ratings, and it, failed against all of these other shows that didn't have these big budgets, and so it sucks. But in this post-Netflix era, I mean, you get to see like, oh, this show, okay, Netflix isn't like exactly super forthcoming with its numbers, but you can see when something hits top 10 in every single country. You can see when something is number one for 5 weeks straight. You can have more data points to draw upon so that you're not only looking at the originating industry, because now everybody has access to this content and we all matter. And I think that's really interesting because my watch back in 2016 did not count against or for a show's success metric. It was outside of the system and we didn't matter. What I mean by that is international fandom wasn't really legible inside that Korean success narrative back then. There were platforms back in 2016 and also international distribution, but that wasn't a part of the numbers that built the argument of Moon Lovers failing to deliver. And now if I watch or stream on any streamer service or on YouTube or whatever, it's going to be logged somewhere in a view counter. And it doesn't necessarily count in the same way all the time. Like, it doesn't mean that a producer gets more money. It doesn't necessarily translate into a specific concrete thing, but I have this feeling that my vote got logged somewhere. And so I think that that's a really interesting question to explore. I want to do it more in a future video when I have a little bit more time to get into the mechanics of what the Korean production system was and how streaming changed it. So stay tuned. I'm still kind of ruminating on that in my head, but it's something that I have given a lot of thought to, having been part of the machine and then having spent a lot more time outside of it. So we'll see. And also as a part of that, an interesting footnote in the history of Moon Lovers is that it did experience a resurgence, not only internationally, but within Korea itself. So I think it first came onto Netflix during the pandemic around 2020. Before then, because it was an SBS show, it would have been aired on SBS. And then, aside from things like reruns or watching it directly on the SBS website or on a Korea-based streaming service, it wouldn't have really popped up again. It would have been part of the library catalog, but it kind of was dormant. Starting in 2020, it coincides with the pandemic. I don't want to say it's only because of the pandemic, but we had a lot of time on our hands. We were watching a lot of things. And it wasn't just Netflix, but it was also the Korean streamers like Wave and Kupang. Older shows became available and it actually did kind of have a second go at it, where a lot of people who hadn't seen it in the day started seeing it. And because they weren't mired in sort of the media criticism of the time, I think they were able to just view it as a fan. And I think the reception at that point was a lot more positive. And I know that, you know, IU and Jun-gi specifically found more appreciation than they had initially. And also, like, to be fair, IU and Jun-gi had some breakouts since then. So like IU had Hotel Del Luna, My Mister, and Jun-gi had Flower of Evil. I think there were a lot of fans who were like really happy to see this drama for the first time. And then also, even more recently, we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of this show. I didn't even realize when I had first picked it, but August 29th is the 10-year anniversary of its first air date. And IU being in Perfect Crown recently, not just her being in a drama, but in Perfect Crown, there are scenes where she's like wearing that royal attire. And I think she even posted on her Instagram her wearing hanbok for Perfect Crown. Fun side fact while we're talking about Perfect Crown, Pyeonwoo is actually in Moon Lovers. He had a blink and you'll miss it role as IU's cheating ex-boyfriend in her modern day life. It's just a fun bit of trivia that resurfaced when they paired up in Perfect Crown. It kind of triggered a little bit of a nostalgia moment for Moon Lovers, and so I think it enjoyed a little bit of a blip in recent history as well. So, coming back to our initial 3 questions. If I had to put it in a nutshell, number 1, why did Korea insist that Moon Lovers was a failure? It legitimately underperformed these enormous expectations. It had visible execution issues, but it also became this perfect object upon which these greater industry anxieties and also this like really irresistible narrative of a winner-loser dynamic could then be projected. Number 2, why don't I remember it as a failure? As fans, we didn't experience the show primarily as a failure. We were watching it for a lot of other considerations at the time, and all of the ratings numbers and behind the scenes industry narratives, they existed outside of our experience of the show. And when you put all this time behind us, what really lasts is our emotional memory of the show, and all the other stuff fades away. And finally, number 3, who gets to decide what a success or a failure even is? So maybe Moon Lovers was a failure by some objective measures that existed at the time, but those measures didn't have the last word. And with all of the changes that have come, not only just in the Korean production industry, but also the broader like global entertainment landscape, the story continued, and it didn't end with the numbers that closed out the run in 2016. So ultimately, the failure narrative ended in 2016, but the show's legacy didn't end there. It continued to grow and evolve and change with the shifting times and land us in a different place today. So I think ultimately, okay, so like the funny thing is that I have these notes and they're not really in-depth notes all the time. And I have written here conclusion, the fandom one, question mark. And you know what? I'm just going to end with that.